Hey there, welcome back to Edgier Than Thou. This week, or last week, who knows when I'm recording this, it occurred to me a second ago that I wrote that as a joke for me in the script. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to say out loud. Then I added a little bit where I was going to do some voiceover. Alright, that joke was nonsense. Anyhow, about a month ago now, the universe made its calling for me pretty clear. Media Matters posted their daily clip of some Daily Wire host saying something embarrassing, which is far from abnormal, but in this particular case, it was one of their more benign gaffes. Rather than a clip of Michael Knowles explaining why God's plan for the transes is genocide, it was just a stupid Matt Walsh bit talking about how trans men being let into men's bathrooms is going to make them into a social occasion where they used to not be one. This chair's so squeaky. His argument basically boils down to the asinine, because trans men are actually women, they're going to treat the bathroom as a social gathering, somewhat ironically undermining his later point that trans women base their gender identity off of grotesque stereotypes. Matthew 7:5, my good friend. But that's not what we're here to talk about. No, for that, I'm going to have to take you through my headspace this week. See, the bit that called out to me the most about this clip was probably one of the most unassuming parts to the average person.
Next thing you know, you're going to be at the urinal and some post-op, quote, trans man is going to slide up in right next to you, and which will be the first problem, because all men know that you never, ever use the urinal right next to another guy unless there's no other availables. This is man code, but women don't know about man code because they're not men.
It occurs to me that I never really challenge his assertion that apparently the average woman doesn't know that it would be awkward to go and stand next to another guy at a urinal. When I think that the average woman probably has figured that one out, and if not, the minute she is presented with the issue, she would figure it out. And this just kind of speaks to, I don't know, how dumb he thinks women are, how low of an opinion he has of them. And I just think that's really interesting. It's not really the major point that I'm going to make, but it's embarrassing that he apparently thinks women are that dumb. It is really just him being very dumb. Upon hearing this, I began to think a little bit more about how the tradcon anti-trans advocate types of people have to toe like a really weird line. One where a person's gender or their sex is based off of one singular variable, which for the purposes of this video, I'm pretty much just going to simplify to be the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. And of course, that it's based on nothing else. And then simultaneously, they believe in this idea of some sort of a hidden unspoken code of manhood and womanhood. The idea of making a video on that subject crossed my mind, but a single Daily Wire host making that blunder really isn't enough to kind of fuel the point that I wanted to make, and so I didn't actively plan on making it. But then, in response to a grifter who is honestly so transparent and so meaningless that their name doesn't even warrant mentioning here, one of the co-CEOs, I'm not double-checking that for the script, of the Daily Wire, Jeremy Boring, posted this tweet. Notable to us here is the incomplete sentence, because an unmarried male can never fully be a man. Shit, well, that's two examples of obvious dissonance, but not quite enough to fuel... Alright, universe, I get it. Let's talk about the conservative conception of gender and sex. The 2020s iteration of transphobia has kind of, in recent years at least, consolidated around this idea of biological essentialism. From what I've observed, that seems to mostly have been popularized by the TERFs, who kind of paved the way for more open conservatives to gravitate away from the more religious arguments in favor of a more optically legitimate scientific view of transphobia. A shift somewhat mirrored by their shift from creationism to what they now call intelligent design, something that they also seem to be more commonly adopting these days. This view is probably best represented by the pithy definition they give, right? A woman is an adult human female, and of course the less common logical follow-up to that, which is that a man is an adult human male. Conservatives on the issue have made it pretty clear that this definition is entirely binary, and it's based off of whatever niche biological trait they've decided is important today, whether that be gametes, Y chromosomes, the SRY gene. You ask 5 different conservatives what makes one a man, and you get 5 different answers. What's so interesting about this rigid of a definition is that it's, by its very nature, boxed its users out of any sort of social characteristic of maleness or femaleness. By simply defining manhood as the presence of a few fancy chemicals, they've stripped the definition of any sort of conversational meaning. To this conservative, the statement, "a man is virtuous," is entirely indistinguishable from the statement, "living as an adult human with a Y chromosome entails virtue." An utterly absurd sentence implicit in which is the idea that the absence of a Y chromosome somehow precludes one from virtue. Man code is no longer like a really interesting kind of element of an experience of growing up in a particular social role. Now, I guess it's just like a series of nitrogenous bases. If we take this definition seriously, there suddenly becomes no such thing as a real man, because being a man has nothing to do with who you are, what you do. All it is the arrangement of, the first few rows of the periodic table inside of your body. I bring this topic up because it's so incredibly obvious to me that when you put all of their sentences in a line together, that conservatives know that gender is a social construct. They can't not know that. When they say that an action, an affectation, or a characteristic is manly, they're not saying this characteristic is indicative of a person's somatic cells containing Y chromosomes. Most of them don't know what a chromosome is. No. Obviously, they're making an assertion about a person's social identity and then pretending that the argument is rooted in hard and fast biology. I imagine Matt Walsh probably knows that it makes no sense to say that women can't understand man code if men are simply chromosome carriers and not a social identity. I imagine Jeremy Boring probably knows that when he does those obnoxious chocolate ads, it makes no sense to use almonds as a metaphorical representation of manhood when his entire political movement is dedicated to the idea that men and women are nothing more than one of 2 possible collections of chemicals in a field of study that they've never even pretended to be interested in. I thought about putting a clip from one of those videos, one of those ads in this video. But honestly, I just kind of like the idea of somebody coming back here like 5 years from now, if people are looking at this video at all, and having absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. And Ben Shapiro, well, he knows better. Truth is, gender is obviously a lot of things. It's complicated. It's interesting. There's definitely an element that's influenced by a person's biological sex. In fact, there's a fairly large element, I would wager. But even then, it's not based off of one singular variable. It's based off of a whole vast number of things, especially when you're talking about it in the social sense, which is what actually matters when we talk about men and women and all of the things in between. Even looking solely at cis people for a moment, the way that gender is expressed, the way that it's maintained, the way that it's reinforced is dependent on so many different factors, after a certain point, most of which have very, very little to do with the chromosomes inside of their body. I mean, to the point that there exist a number of people who do not know, and in fact may never know, what their chromosomes are. But fascist political ideas are kind of based off of this contradiction. In the same way that the statements, "everyone has gone mad with gender ideology," and also "nobody believes in gender ideology," that conservatives are both a dying breed and the silent majority, gender is both a biological fact and a social performance. It has to be both of those things in order for their logic to work. It's not really difficult to see the reason behind this, of course. Conservatism broadly and fascism in particular are based on idealizing traditional social roles and demonizing the other, with kind of a hint of sexual insecurity thrown in there for good measure. By upholding hegemonic gender roles, it allows the conservative man to maintain his control over women and largely avoid their scrutiny. And therefore, he must find some way to legitimize his repulsion at the idea of bending those roles. As because the Bible says so continues to fall out of favor in society, and for good reason, they need to come up with new, equally vapid but optically more defensible ways to ultimately make the exact same case. I know that for a lot of folks, it's probably getting difficult to pretend that there's any sort of biological legitimacy to the conservative position on this issue, especially as conservatives continue to brag about the fact that they don't know what mRNA is, or are actually actively pushing forward the idea that evolution is a lie somehow, something that I'm shocked is coming back to the extent that it is, and that I might talk about at some point in the future, because, I mean, it is funny. Regardless, it would be a whole lot simpler for everyone involved if we were just to drop the pretext and actually get down to brass tacks. Conservatives will waffle on and brag about the fact that supposedly lefties can't answer the question, what is a woman? Not because we haven't answered it centillions of times, but because they're operating under a bizarre, misplaced sense of arrogance. It's a mindset in which the sentence, a man is a person whose identity most closely aligns with the masculine social archetype, is apparently liberal nonsense, but somehow one who does not treat the restroom as a social occasion, possesses a Y chromosome in more than 50% of their diploid cells, is perfectly cogent. Anyhow, thanks for watching this one to the end. I had a lot of fun putting this one together. I think it's interesting to kind of talk about, like, taking some of these ideas to their logical conclusion. I think I laid them out fairly well here, but I'm definitely interested in hearing people's thoughts on it. It's weird, right? It's weird hearing someone in one breath give you these sweeping generalizations of what it means to be a man that all rely on these microscopic, invisible facts about someone, stuff that we didn't, a lot of stuff anyway, that we didn't even know existed until the 20th century. And that then in the same breath start talking about how men ought to be. I mean, there's no way for that argument to be made and not be religious. And I'm interested in kind of exploring that more, because there's something really interesting about, you know, trying to secularize this argument, about trying to, I don't know, come up with some way in which you can derive a social ought from a biological is, but ultimately the fact that you can't do that. It would be interesting to kind of talk about and talk about with a person and kind of get an idea of where they're coming from, and, you know, hopefully move them over to the correct position on this issue. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. If you have any hot takes on any of it, I would definitely be interested in hearing. Good Lord. Okay. Now, see, this is why I should be talking from a script. Does it mean I have to put a whole lot more cuts into the video? Yes, it does. But on the other hand, you get less of that. I know my hair's probably getting in my face right now, so, you know, I would appreciate the liking and the subscribing. You know, I enjoy doing this a lot. I enjoy getting people's feedback. I enjoy talking to people about it, and I get to do that more the more people who are watching. But with that, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Thanks again, I guess. I don't know. You could have clicked off by now.